Yes.
Are you considered absent if you attend on Zoom or not?
You're not considered absent if you attend on Zoom. Well, try not to.
Yeah.
The rabbis, when we had no choice, Zoom was the way we conducted the class. But you lose something without having a group together to deal with and meet each other and kind of interact, what have you. So we really don't want you using Zoom unless it's absolutely necessary. Somebody's sick, get lots of that, or things come up. I understand that. Okay, but try not if it's more than 5 times, I won't count it against you, but that's supposed to be the limit. Okay. Also, I sent out information about a Hebrew class that's being conducted on Zoom. We will start our Hebrew in a few weeks as well. I haven't chosen exactly what text I'm going to use. You have to pay for it now, so I'm trying to figure out a way of doing it very cheap. I've copied some things from different sources, and so I may use that. I'll email it to everybody, and then you will be responsible for printing it out and bringing it to class unless it's a problem somebody has. Okay, and then it gives me more flexibility also to throw some things in there. All right. All right, so was that and Zoom? What else was I going to say? Okay. So tonight we're going to start talking about Shabbat. And really, as I'm always apologizing, but the reality is we're always jumping in the middle of something. We don't have information we really needed for that, and because we haven't got to it yet. So it's kind of strange to talk about the laws of Shabbat after we've already talked about the laws and practices of Yom Tov. But that's how we have to do it, because we want to give you some information about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot before they all come in. All right. So Shabbat is uniquely Jewish. Historians of religion, historians of Judaism, look around. Is there anything else in the ancient world that parallels the concept of Shabbat? And the answer is no. There's absolutely none. Harvest festivals, celebrations, what have you, there are lots of parallels. And if you want to assume that Judaism took it from someone else, you can perhaps do that. But there is nothing that parallels the concept of Shabbat. The idea of celebrating one day a week of God's creation. And even when Christianity took it over, they moved it from Shabbat to Sunday, which is the Lord's Day. Islam celebrates it on Friday. And there are no restrictions that I know of in terms of Islam for their Friday observance, except it's a special time to go to the mosque. Certainly early Christians at some stage of history had restrictions on Sunday, especially in North America. And when I moved to Toronto just when they finally got rid of the Sunday blue laws here. So all those things existed, but again, they're not completely parallel. So one day a week to refrain from working, refrain from various kinds of activities, and it's not a bad day. It's not a horrible day, a day that you're worried about doing something. It's going to be bad luck or anything like that. Because there's some things like that in Babylonian traditions. That's not our concept of Shabbat. The first mention of Shabbat comes at the very early part of the Torah. We read in the opening chapters of Genesis, this creation story. And then we begin chapter 2. By the way, the chapter divisions of the Bible are not originally Jewish. They come from Christian hands. And a lot of Jewish Bibles in general adopted those divisions, but they entered Judaism very late. And usually we refer to the Sabbath Torah portion. And now, of course, today we will use chapter and verse, but that's a much later edition. Okay. So the beginning of what we call today chapter 2, after the 6 days of creation. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them, everything goes along with heaven and earth. God, and on the seventh day, God ended his work or completed his work which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day, and made it holy, sanctified it. Because on that day he rested from all his work or labor which he had created, God had created to continue in existence or to make. A lot of these things are hard to translate exactly. But one thing that is even more difficult to translate is the word that's probably used more than anything else in this passage, malacha. What in English we usually say work. Malacha is not work. If you wanted to find work in physics, expenditure of energy to move matter. I think that's what the physicist calls it, right? Any physicists here? Major. All right. Am I close to it?
Yes.
Okay. Has nothing to do with the expenditure of energy to move matter. I can walk around my house. Theoretically, if I wanted to, I could pick up my sofa and carry it from downstairs to upstairs. That's why I'm in a condo now, so I don't have to do that. But if I were to walk out of my house into a public thoroughfare, which all these things I'll explain in more detail later, and I have a feather in my pocket, I violated the Sabbath. Okay? So we have to define the word malacha so that we can understand what we mean when we're supposed to rest from malacha. For lack of a better term, I'm going to use the English word labor, work, but know that that's in parentheses, quotation marks, right? Because it's not really work in that sense. After all, think about it for a moment. How much work did God have to do according to the Bible to create the world? Vayomer Elohim yehi or, God said, let there be light. That's not a lot of work to do that. And the waters be gathered together under the heavens. Let a firmament be in the heavens. God made the sun and the moon. They didn't spend a lot of energy, as far as we can tell, on doing any of that. Okay. So we know that the word malacha will come eventually. It's found in a passage talking about the creation of the temple, of the tabernacle. So in Deuteronomy 12, 5:12, it says, "Shomoret Yom HaShabbat LeKadesho," guard, preserve the Sabbath to make it holy. Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, as Lord your God has commanded you. Sheish yamim tavod v'asita kol malachtecha. 6 days shall you avod, work, labor, and perform all of your malacha. V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha, and the seventh day shall be a Shabbat to the Lord your God. Lo ta'aseh kol melacha, do not perform any kind of melacha. Ata uvincha avidcha avavdecha v'matcha v'shorcha v'chamorcha v'chaventcha v'gercha asher yisharecha, you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servants, your ox, your ass, You're called the beast, the stranger who is in your gates, Laman, Yanuach, Avdecha, Ve'amatcha, Kamocha, so they should rest like you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Lord your God took you out of there. Biyad chazakav, or on the tiyah with a strong and outreaching arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. All right, now, that is the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. The Ten Commandments, as is repeated in Deuteronomy, references God's malacha, but emphasizes the human element. You are slaves. You make your servants rest. You let your servants rest. It's really a social phenomenon. Yes, it's a remembrance of God's creation. But the emphasis in Deuteronomy is not on creation, but on human servitude, human bondage. In Exodus, where the Ten Commandments is first appears, and you would have thought that since it's right after the Exodus of Egypt, it would have emphasized that concept of bondage. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Different words. Zachor, remember, and Shamor, to watch over, to observe. Zachor is a positive act, to do something, to remember it, to show your remembrance of it. Shamor is a negative, a restraint. Don't do some things, guard it. Sheish yamim tavo, again, 6 days shall you labor. Vasita kol malachtecha, and perform all of your work, your malacha. V'yom hashvi shabbat Hashem elokecha, on the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Kol malacha, all kinds of malacha, you, your son, your daughter, your servants, male, female servants, animals, etc., in your gates shall not do this. Why? Ki sheshet yamim asad noet hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz, because in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. Et hayam mikol hashabam, the sea and all that's in them. V'yanach bayom hashvi'i, and he rested on the seventh day. Al kain beirach Hashem et yom hashabbat v'kadshehu, God rested on the seventh day and made it holy. Here, the emphasis is on creation. We are imitatio Dei, as they say in Yiddish, the Latin for imitating God. Right? Imitatio Dei, we imitate God. God rested, so we rest. God rested from his malacha, so we rest from our malacha. When we observe the Sabbath day, we acknowledge God as the creator of the universe. It doesn't matter if it took 6 days, 7 days, the literal, that's, talk about that more later when we talk about the meaning of what the Torah and Revelation, all that. But what we're saying is, by observing the Sabbath, we observe that there is a creator. The world, the universe does not exist merely by chance. It exists by divine design. How that operated, if it went through Darwin's evolutionary approach, if it went through right away, creating everything all at once in 6 days, that's irrelevant. Because it doesn't matter how God did it. We acknowledge he did do it. When you buy a house, I don't know if it makes a difference to you if it took the builder a month to build it or it took 2 months to build it. You don't care how long it took. As long as it's a good house and it's done well, that's what you want. So that's a Shabbat. Okay. So now, so our problem is, though, how do we define this work, this malacha, that we're told to refrain from? So the general way of trying to understand what a word means in traditional Jewish interpretation is to see how that word is used the first time in the Bible. And if that doesn't help us, other places in the Bible where it's used. Now, I like to listen to a podcast called Data versus Dogma, which is done by an interesting fellow. Actually, he's a Mormon, and it's a very non-traditional read on the Bible. Believe me, if you are a firm believer in the God gave the Torah, Mount Sinai, and everything and all of that, you're not going to like the program. If you have an open mind to listen to different things, all right. So he would argue you can't do that. There are different disparate parts of the Bible, and you can't read from one part of the Bible to find something else. Well, I'm ignoring that. Judaism as a tradition ignores that. Whether it's true or not, I don't care. Our tradition is built upon seeing the Bible as a unit, even if there are sometimes problems with that, and the rabbis had problems with certain parts. But they use the various elements to define the whole. So where do we see the word malacha? We're told that when the tabernacle, that was a portable structure towards the second half of the book of Exodus, that's what it's mostly concerned with, the creation of this tabernacle, a wooden-sided tent-like structure where sacrifices are offered. They're told to build it, to make it. But they're also told, you must, however, not do the work on Shabbat. When constructing the tabernacle, you cannot perform malacha. And so the rabbis saw in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, the idea that this was the paradigm for understanding malacha. Now, whether or not it's clear that they tried to fit 39 categories of labor, 39 constructs of, that's an interesting word, of activities that were used in construction of the tabernacle to serve as the general rubric for what malacha it consists of. Now, whether or not they had the tradition of 39 malachot and then they read it into the story of the tabernacle, or some shop guy divided it from that, is I don't know, I can't answer. But that becomes the basic structure for understanding how we are to observe the Shabbat. Now, before we go into some details, and I sent this all out to you, but before we go into details, we have to understand a basic premise. If I earn my living as a house painter, I would certainly regard painting houses as work. If I am an artist, as just part-time, I just do it for enjoyment. Right? I'm not selling anything. Nobody would buy my garbage. That's not work, painting. Put some paint on a canvas and create something out of it. That's not work. So to the painter, it's work. It's work. To the part-time artist, it's not work. How can you create a community, a sense of communality, unless you define things together? So the idea of creating these categories is to create an atmosphere so that everyone who's under the rubric of the Jewish people knows what they're supposed to do and not do in Shabbat. And thus creating this sense of community, of the communal Shabbat. Now, one of the words that frequently mentioned in terms of Shabbat is B'yakadshehu, God sanctified it. The word kadosh, holy, kuf, daled, shin, 3 letters. Kuf, a K, a D, and SH, right? Those 3 letters are the basic root of words that mean holy, sanctity, or to sanctify, to set apart, to make distinct. When a man and a woman get married, the first act is kiddushin. Kiddushin is when a man traditionally gives a woman an object of value. Today, normally a ring. He says, "Hare at mikudeshet li." You are mikudash to me. You're holy to me. What do you mean holy to me? It means that we have a union in an earlier world where a man might have more than one wife. Granted, that was a reality, but the woman couldn't have more than one husband. You're welcome to come in if you really want. She's set apart from the rest of the world. But, language changes and meanings change, but the idea behind it, set apart, just like the word for a temple prostitute was a kadesha, same root. When we sanctify the Sabbath by making a prayer over wine, mekadesh Shabbat, we're sanctifying the Sabbath. So our actions also sanctify the Sabbath. The major difference between the sanctity of the Sabbath and the sanctity of Sukkot, for example, goes back to our calendar. Okay. By the way, I think maybe next week at the time, I'll give you a practice exam next week. It doesn't count. It's just to let you know what kind of things that I will be looking for. So I usually do that. We'll go over in class. Okay. So, but getting to that, okay, lost my train of thought there. All right, but anyway, so, so remember with the calendar, it rested upon the Beit Din, the court, to decide if the new moon was present. Remember that? All those weeks ago that we talked about that, right? The court would meet, people would come, say, we saw the new moon, and the members of the court would say, was it in the east, the west, high up in the sky, low in the, then they would determine whether or not they really saw it. If they determined they saw it that the previous night, that morning is the first day of the month. If they didn't see it that night, or for whatever reason the court wants to delay the onset of the month by a day, today is the 30th day of the previous month, right? Remember that? Say, nod your heads, so pretend you listen to me. Okay. So who decides when the Rosh Chodesh is? People. Israel, through the Beit Din. Who decides when it's Shabbat? Do we have to take a vote when it's Shabbat? No. It comes every Friday night. Granted, if you're lost in the middle of the desert and you don't know what day of the week it is, the rabbis say you start counting and the seventh day for you is Shabbat, but when you get back to civilization, you'll get back on the right calendar. But God makes the Shabbat. So Mekadesh HaShabbat, we say in the Kiddush, we say Mekadesh HaShabbat. God sanctifies the Sabbath. When we talk about the Kiddush for Yom Tov, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron. Or Mekadesh HaShabbat v'Yisrael v'Yom HaZikaron. Sanctifies the Sabbath and Israel in the new months because Israel decides. Okay. So we are bound by tradition, by the words of the Torah, to make this a holy day through our activities, even though it's holy whether we observe it or not. Now, when the rabbis came up with the 39 categories of labor, and one of my colleagues was very careful to ask people in the exam when they went before the Beit Din, what is the work that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat? So please try to remember some of these ideas. All right. Sowing, taking seed and throwing it into the field. Plowing, right? That's putting the furrow in the ground so that you cover the seed. Reaping, when you do begin the harvest of wheat and rice, of grains. Binding the sheaves, tying them together. Threshing, taking those sheaves, bringing it in, beating off the kernels so that they separate from the stalks, and trying to break the seed cover. Winnowing, right? You throw the basket up in the air, and the chaff gets blown away, and what comes down is the seed. Selecting, picking out good and bad from a list of things that's in front of you. I got this. I took the wheat. I did it up in the air, and now I'm looking at it, and there's a rock in here. I want to throw that away. That's picking. Or I have a bowl of grapes in front of me, and I pick out the bad grapes and throw them away. If I take a grape and eat it, that's okay. But if I take a grape and throw it away, that's selecting. All right, grinding, taking that wheat, that barley, whatever it is, making it into flour, sifting the flour, kneading the dough, and then baking it. As you can see, this is the whole process of making bread. So the acts that are necessary in making bread, and bread was used with some of the sacrifices in the tabernacle. And those acts that would fall under them all come under these 11 restrictions. So, for example, baking, it doesn't matter if I'm baking bread or I'm baking an egg. It's still baking. No, I won't go there. Okay. So that's field work, as the list that I gave you says. Then the next is making is listed as making material curtains, shearing wool. Right. So we're talking about shearing. Anybody here do any shearing? Right. But if you cut your hair, that's shearing. Okay. Cleaning. Wool has to be cleaned, and combing it out. It's good question. On Shabbat, are you allowed to really use a fine-tooth comb on your hair? Some of us don't have to worry about it too much anymore. I do have a little beard. Maybe a brush is better because it's white. I'm not going to pull anything out. Dyeing. If you're going to make curtains, you have to dye the wool. D-Y-E, not killing, dyeing. Spinning, creating threads. Then the next few are things involved in making a curtain or making a material, stretching the threads over the loom, making loops in the loom, then weaving the threads and separating the threads, tying a knot. Rabbis understood mean a permanent knot, and untying a permanent knot. Okay? So there's questions. You can tie your shoe on Shabbat or not. It's a source of disagreement. Okay. And some say it has to be more of an expert kind of knot. So if you know how to tie a tie real easily, then you're okay. If you have a hard tie and need an expert, it's another question. Okay. Sewing. This is the SCW, sewing. And then tearing. But tearing for the purpose of making something. If I'm tearing some cloth because I want to fix it or bind it in some way, that's forbidden. If I just tear because I'm being destructive, that's not right and shouldn't be doing it, but that's not one of the categories of labor. Then making leather material or leather curtains, trapping animals, slaughtering the animals, skinning to get their hide, tanning the hide, smoothing out the hide, putting lines to mark where you're going to cut the leather, and the cutting of the leather. That goes where it's curtains. It goes if it's shoes. Yes.
The tearing. What about the tearing?
It has to be for a constructive purpose. Okay, so there's an interesting question there. Is it for constructive purpose or not? Well, there's a certain degree of constructive purpose to it because you want to use it. Then there are those that say, well, you haven't done it before, and kavod briot, to honor people, you do it. They didn't really talk about it in the biblical times because they used to use stones. That's right. That was a what? Smooth stones. No, some are sharper than others, but that's what they use. And thank God we've got toilet paper or tissue paper. Uh, I prefer not to tear it on Shabbat, so we use Kleenex or something like that. Some are very, very stringent. Some, say tear. Well, paper towels we tear before Shabbat because we're tearing it for a purpose. We're not tearing it just to be tearing it. We're going to use it for something. So that's considered to be a constructive act. Right? If I tear it through a spider web, well, first of all, I shouldn't go around tearing up spider webs. But if I'm walking through the room and I tear up a spider web, so what? Okay. Sure. Nope. Always ask it. Don't need to polish.
You mentioned earlier about like carrying things in the college ground.
Carry.
So how come you don't have to be like naked?
Oh, we'll talk. We'll hold that for later. Yeah. We will talk about it. It's a good question. But I defy you to go walking around here in December naked, but that's a different story.
It's not bad. Yeah.
Maybe in June or July you can, but all right. Now, interesting enough, when the tabernacle was put together, they had these wooden panels and they marked them to know which goes with which, because always a problem. And those who put up wooden sukkahs know that something's a good idea to make sure they're marked, know which goes with which. So writing for a permanent purpose of marking something. The rabbi said it's at least 2 letters. And erasing something that was meant to be permanent. Okay. Now, putting up and taking down the Mishkan means building, doing any kind of construction, or tearing it down, breaking it down. And then the last, in some ways, are catch-alls because they didn't fit in anywhere else specifically. This is called the Mishkan's final touches, extinguishing a fire. Not allowed to light a fire, also. So there are 2 sides of the same coin, but they obviously, if you're baking bread, you need a fire. You can't light a fire on Shabbat. If you're through with the baking and you want to save the coals for later, you can't cover the coals to put the flame out. Was called in Hebrew makeh papatish, striking the final hammer blow. Literally, makeh papatish is that when a blacksmith is using a hammer to hammer something out, what's the last thing he does or she does? Hits the anvil with a hammer. That's to smooth out the hammer. All right? But the rabbi said anything that is not completely finished yet and requires that action to finish it, making it into something that's usable, that is not permitted on Shabbat. So an example that is used and discussed, if I have a can that I want to open on Shabbat, we don't think of it that way, but in the ancient world, I'm making a container. By taking the lid off of that can with the can opener, I'm creating a vessel that can hold something. Right? And the recipe says you put in the can of tomatoes, crushed tomatoes, and 2 more cans full of water. You see, it's used as a utensil. So if you put a little hole in the bottom and then you open it up, make sure you have it dripping to where you want it to go, then you're not making a utensil because it's been ruined for being a utensil. That's destruction without a purpose. You're not trying to make it into something. And the last one, carry. Now, what does mean carrying in the public domain? This is one of the most difficult ones to understand. And the best way, first of all, to understand it is when as the Talmud discusses, how do you take possession of a movable object, of my telephone? How do you take possession of it? All right? How does it transfer to your ownership? I pick it up. I carry it to my house. I'm moving it from one domain, the domain of the seller, transferring it into my domain. Okay? So the rabbi said essentially there were two basic domains. There's a private domain and there's a public domain. Private belongs to me. Public is everybody. So if you walk out to the synagogue onto the street, that's a public thoroughfare. But they also understood that there has to be more of a definition of what makes it public. And originally we find the rabbis use a description that says anything that is at least 16 amot cubits wide. Cubit is 18 to 24 inches, depending upon your measurement. Street that wide, that goes straight, and 600,000 people walk on it in a day. So by that definition, maybe the 401 is a public thoroughfare. Certainly the street out here is not. And the rabbis then said they defined a second category, what they called a Carmelite. Carmelite is not public, but it's not private. This is a rabbinic creation. And as a matter of fact, when we come to the laws of Shabbat, the rabbis say themselves in the very early part of the tractate of Shabbat, the Talmud deals with it, most of the laws are like hanging by a hair. If very little support in lots of laws that the rabbis came up with. They're very well aware that they're creating these various things. So now, private, any area that's got about a fence at least 10 handbreadths high, fenced in, or 10 handbreadths down, dig a pit, that's private. A public, anything that's 600,000 people walk across daily. Carmelite, everything in between. So the rabbi said, we will not allow you to carry in the Carmelite, lest you end up carrying in the public domain. All right, it's a fence around the Torah. And that became the standard. So now, by that rule of thumb, I should be able to carry in my backyard, but going out my front door, since there's nothing fenced in outside of the front door, I shouldn't be able to carry it. What if I put a fence around my front yard? Then I can carry it. What if I put a fence around the whole neighborhood and everybody joins in together and cooperates with this fence? I'm in a gated community. Got my armed guards at the gates and machine guns. Nobody comes in on Shabbos on penalty of death. All right? That's a fence. That's now private. So if you fence in an area that's a Carmelite, you're allowed to carry on Shabbat those things that you can use. Okay? And that's really what we operate under today. This part of Toronto has what is called an A-roof. An A-roof is it's more than an imaginary fence, but not much more. It is a string or it's a cord. It's some kind of fencing. Usually it's something on the top of poles or attached to foam poles that go around the area. It's checked to make sure it doesn't break. And as long as that is whole, observant Jews are allowed to carry on Shabbat within that A-roof. Now, not everybody holds by it. Especially Chabad, for example, doesn't hold by A-roof, so they don't carry on Shabbat, even if everybody else says there's an A-roof. And that's why you'll see many men on Shabbat in certain neighborhoods wearing their talis to shul. Now to your question. If you're wearing it, you're not carrying it. Carrying is this, I'm carrying. Put it on my shoulder, I'm carrying it. I put it on my head, I'm carrying it. If I'm wearing it, if it's an article of clothing, that's not considered to be carrying.
Pretty protective, no?
No, not really. How much, clothing is clothing. What do you want to add to it?
Like it's a lead, it's like you're carrying it on your shoulders.
Well, no, because actually the Talmud frequently says the very opening of Metziah, the second chapter. Let me see, it's the second chapter about Metziah. Anyway, yes, second chapter. There's socks. No, that's the first one. Two guys walking down the street, and they see a talit lying on the ground. And they all both jump for it. It's a nice looking talit. They both want it for themselves. They both grab hold of it. Who gets ownership of it? They go to court and they argue over it. Well, the word uses talit. Now, they're not talking about a ritual talit. They're talking about a coat, a cloak that was worn in the outside. A talit in the Talmud is your outer garment, your cloak. Has four corners, so you put tzitzit on it, ritual fringes. And when we no longer wore clothing like that on a normal way of doing things, it became associated with at least worship in the synagogue. You could put on a talit, so at least you're fulfilling the mitzvah of putting tzitzit on a four-cornered garment. Do you absolutely have to wear a talit? No. If you have a four-cornered garment and you're wearing it during the day, do you have to have tzitzit on it? Yes. So it's not subjective in that sense. Although there's some who want to say if you roll it up and you stick it under your coat and you're not wearing it out, that's carrying it. There's an interesting discussion about that. And the rabbis frowned upon it. Mostly they're frowning upon women wearing jewelry, because men didn't wear much in the way of jewelry in those days, although they had earrings.
Yeah.
And they were concerned about taking it off and showing somebody in the public thoroughfare, and then forgetting and carrying it. Since there's no public thoroughfares, I don't think you need to worry about, unless you go to one real public thoroughfare. Maybe, Broadway in Manhattan is a public thoroughfare. That's why there's a big fight over whether or not you can have Eruv around Manhattan Island. So now, so when the Talmud talks about carrying, we're really talking about two different things. We're talking about transferring it from public to private, and we're talking about carrying basically four steps in the public thoroughfare. Those are the two real issues that we have. So in this part of town, if you carry your siddur to the synagogue, it's no problem, because there is an Eruv, unless you don't hold by Eruv. You with me? I haven't lost anybody yet? Okay. But getting back to its very beginnings of it, it's because it's what business needs. You have to transport from one place to another, from one domain to another. How could you do business without transferring from one domain to another, carrying? So that, I think, is the central core of the ruling, is this idea that it's so much involved with the act of business. So now, so the rabbis decreed that not only should one avoid forbidden acts on Shabbat, which they say is a biblical rule. There are two types of laws the rabbis refer to. There's the oraita, which is from an Aramaic word, meaning from the Torah. The Torah says, "Lo taviru esh b'mashotechem b'yom HaShabbat." You will not kindle a fire, a flame, in your communities on Shabbat. That's a clear Torah law. Torah says, don't do it. Then there are what are called the Rabbanan. These are rabbinic enactments, usually meant to protect us violating the Torah. Carrying in the non-public domain, the Carmelit, without the Eruv, that's a D'Rabbanan, that's a rabbinic enactment. You're still responsible for violating either one, but the rules are different for the two different categories. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we say if you have doubt if the act and action is biblically prohibited or not, you don't know. I don't know if the Bible says you can't do this. Then you have to be stringent. You follow the more stringent interpretation. If you don't know if the rabbis forbade it, it's a rabbinic rule, then you can be more lenient. You can follow the more lenient position. That's the only real difference. In the time of the temple, if I violated the Shabbat by accident, it's interesting. We're talking about by accident. I didn't mean to. I know carrying is not permitted on Shabbat, but I forgot it was Shabbos. Or I knew it was Shabbat, but I forgot you're not allowed to carry. You violated the Shabbat. What do? You bring a sacrifice to the temple to make up for it. If I know it's Shabbat, and I know I'm not allowed to carry on Shabbat, I don't bring a sacrifice to the temple. I don't get out that easy. You have to work it out with God some way, more than that. Essentially, for mistakes, unintentional errors, you bring a sacrifice. For intentional errors, you don't. You might have thought of the other way around, but that's not how it's understood. Okay. So since you're not allowed to violate any rule of the Torah, you shouldn't do anything that resembles a prohibited act or could be confused with a prohibited act. Or it's a habit linked with a prohibited act. Something's always involved with it. Or usually leads to performing a prohibited act. So this is what we call a fence around the Torah. So for example, ripping up a piece of paper was forbidden since it resembles cutting to shape or could be confused with it. If you're just tearing it, it may be okay. But if you're tearing it, it may look like you're trying to form something, and therefore it would be forbidden. Similarly, agreeing to buy something on Shabbat, just the agreement, was prohibited because most agreements are confirmed in writing. One exception to that rule is to make a shidduch. What a shidduch is? Getting married, to make an agreement to get married, arrange a marriage. That you're allowed to do on Shabbat. It's important. All right. Climbing a tree is forbidden because you might break twigs or tear leaves on the tree. And if you've ever climbed a tree, that's almost definitely going to happen. They call that psikresha. Psikresha is a rabbinic term. It basically means if it's something that's certainly going to happen, it's going to happen. If you do X, Y must follow. That's called psikresha. Psikresha technically means literally means cutting off the head of a chicken. If you cut off the head of a chicken, it's going to die. Yeah.
I basically belaboring these points, but
that's okay. No problem.
I know some modern Orthodox people will they have a helper on Shabbat. It's not Jewish. They'll say it sure starts with my room.
Okay, just a minute. We'll come to this. We'll come to what we call the Shabbos Goy.
Okay.
And we'll definitely talk about the Shabbos Gentile. All right. So now, just to give you a list of kinds of things before we get into that, adding fresh water to a vase of cut flowers, because that can influence the flowers to still bloom or bloom more. That's like sowing, S-O-W. Making a bouquet of flowers is like making a sheaf to harvest. Separating good fruit from spoiled fruit. Right? Is if you pick out to eat, that's okay. If you pick out, put the good one here and the bad one there, that's not allowed. Brushing dried mud from boots or clothes. It's like grinding. Cutting hair or nails, we might want to mention like sheep shearing. Applying makeup, ladies, which is related to dyeing, D-Y-E-N. Braiding hair, which is weaving. Drawing blood for a blood test, unless it's necessary. Say somebody's diabetic and they need to check their blood. That's not forbidden whatsoever. Uh, rubbing soap to make lather, or applying creams and polishing shoes, or using scouring pads for utensils and other surfaces, and scraping, grinding, sharpening a pencil to shape and alter the size, or you're not even supposed to use a pencil anyway. Painting, drawing, typing, making durable marks on durable material. Tearing through letters on a package. That's erasing. You're tearing up the letters. Nobody here would do it, but smoking a cigarette, you shouldn't do it anyway because it should be forbidden 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's cancerous. This list has using telephone. We'll come back to that in a moment about electricity. The same with electric lights, winding a clock, whether you're about wearing glasses, some have some issues if they're not necessary. Okay. First electricity and then the Shabbat story. I've pointed out before, and I will point it out throughout the course of the year. Traditional Judaism, like every tradition, is very conservative, small letter C. Doesn't like changes, right? In our normal lives, we really don't like changes. We have habits. We like things to be the same. We're very happy that some changes come into the world, right? And we adapt to them. But, I want life to be smooth. This business, email is wonderful, except when I get an email at 6:30 tonight, or I looked in the email at 6:30 and said, Rabbi, would you mind if we put the class downstairs? I didn't see it until 6:30 or whatever it was. Okay. So when something new comes in, there's often a knee-jerk reaction to say no. As a rabbi said, it's always easy to say no. You have to think to say yes. So when electricity first was being introduced and being used in various ways, most of the rabbinic authorities prohibited it. They said it was related to fire, or if it wasn't, because let's take an electric light bulb, a filament, and an electric light bulb. I know those are disappearing now. Everybody does remember filaments and light bulbs? You guys keep getting younger every year. At some point in time, that filament burns out. Now, is that really fire or not? What is fire? Fire is rapid oxidation. It's slow oxidation. Okay. So there are various approaches, pro, con. The general rule of thumb in the traditional circles is that electricity is a usage of electricity by your own hands, like turning on and off the light, turning on or off the TV, dialing your telephone, is prohibited. Why? Lots of different possibilities, right? But it's just not, as they say in Yiddish, pasnish. It's just not right. If it's an emergency, all right. But now, there are certain ways around that, but in essence, in the most traditional communities, electricity is not used on Shabbat if you have to actually flick the switch or do something at that moment in time. If it's on a clock, if it operates automatically, even though you had to set the clock before Shabbat began, most authorities permit it because you're not doing it. You're not saying, what's Amazon? I was thinking Siri, but not Siri. Alexa, turn on the lights. You're telling Alexa to turn on the lights. That's not permitted. Okay. Now, but if it does it by itself, or it's on a clock, okay, nothing lost. Now, but you couldn't do that to do something else that is forbidden. For example, I can't have the coffee pot go on, the coffee maker go on Shabbat. Because that's now clearly an act of cooking, and you're causing it, even though it's being started before Shabbat, is clearly taking place in Shabbat, an activity that's forbidden. So almost all authorities will say no. Yes.
I know that some people have an electric warmer to warm food up that they plug in before.
Yeah, it's
Shabbat.
plugged in before Shabbat. There might
They
be
were
plugs.
turning lights on before Shabbat
Yeah,
and leaving them on. as
Yeah,
well.
we're turning them on, leaving them on. Why do we light candles on Friday night? I know it's ritual now, but why? What's the original reason for lighting candles? Save light.
Yeah.
The reason for lighting candles so you have light in your home on Shabbat. That's how they lit their houses. So to leave your electric light on, what's the difference? Whether it's fire or not, no different. Okay. Now, especially in the conservative movement and within the conservative world, there are various opinions about the use of electricity on Shabbat. And for that, I tell you to speak to your own rabbi as to what their position is on the usage of your active usage of electricity on Shabbat. Certainly, even those who might permit, I don't think electricity is forbidden by the Bible. I am convinced it's rabbinic. That doesn't mean merely, but it's rabbinic in order to keep Shabbat in a sense of holiness. But I don't think if somebody turns on a light bulb on Shabbat, they're violating the Torah. Okay, that's my position. But I don't use electricity directly on Shabbat, because it makes a difference. And to do something that really takes away from Shabbat, for example, turning on the timer for the football game, or I guess here I'm still getting used to it after 28 years in Canada, the hockey game. That's one of those things that's pasnish. Technically you might be able to get away with it. Leaving it on, leaving the TV on in the den so it's on when you want to watch it. So at least that's a little bit better. But we really should be doing better things on Shabbat than watching a hockey game. I know to some people that's blasphemy, but what can I tell you? Okay. So again, like I say, speak to your rabbi. Some people are leaning with telephones. You will also see there's a principle in the Talmud called grama. You don't need to remember this per se, but you'll have heard it. Grama means if I do something, but it doesn't cause an immediate response, and I have no control over when that response is actually going to take place. Okay? For example, they have these what they call Shabbat scooters. It's for people who can't walk. My mother, blessed memory, had one. It's one of these scooters, like every other scooter that a disabled person or a person that has problems walking has. But when they push down on the pedal, they don't know when it's going to start. It might start in 2 seconds. It might be 5 seconds. It might start right away. They don't know. So that's an act of grama. You're not causing it directly, and then it takes place. And so, especially, well, in Israel, where it's much more of an issue in many communities, doctors have phones that are specially designed so that they work that way, and other kinds of equipment that normally you wouldn't want to use on Shabbat, but their doctor need to be able to use it. Now, just step back 1 second. Remember, none of this has to do with a person whose life is endangered. If their life is endangered, you do what needs to be done to save the life. I don't care if it's calling on the telephone. I don't care if it's lighting a fire. I don't care what it is. To save a life, pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat, saving a life overrides Shabbat. If you're not sure if it's allowed to be done on Shabbat and you're uncertain, don't ask questions, do it. And as a matter of fact, because of that idea, the sources say if a doctor is called to the hospital on Shabbat, not only can the doctor drive to the hospital, they can drive home. Because if you didn't allow them to drive home, they might be concerned about driving to the hospital on Shabbat and might hesitate to go when somebody's life is at stake. And so the authorities say, if you had to drive on Shabbat, you can drive home on Shabbat. If you are going to see, if God forbid you're accompanying somebody to the hospital, a parent, a spouse, a child, you're not supposed to take a car home. Wait till Shabbat's over. Okay. Now, the rabbi said anything that someone who's Jewish is not permitted to do on Shabbat. The rabbi said you may not ask a non-Jew to do it on Shabbat. Now, there arose the custom is called the Shabbos Goy, to use the Yiddish pronunciation, Goy Shabbat, Shabbat Goy. First, the word Goy means people, nation. In and of itself, there's nothing pejorative to it. As a matter of fact, one of our prayers talks about Israel as being Goy Kadosh, the holy people, the holy Goy. Okay. It is sometimes used by Jews in a negative way. So it's really it's like way it's how it's being used. It's no different than using the term Gentile. I once was asked to speak to a group from a Mormon community. I get to talk to them, and as soon as I began, I called them Gentiles, because Mormons refer to non-Mormons as Gentiles. So I had fun with that, and they all laughed. Right? But it can be used in a very pejorative sense. So you have to be careful on how it's used. Just like there are words in Yiddish for people who are black. The word Schwarz, from the German, means black. Right? There's nothing pejorative of it, but just like the N-word may originally not have been pejorative, certainly today we recognize it as only being pejorative. Okay? So be aware of those things. And then some people, I remember my last class last year, one of the students didn't know what a Yiddish word actually meant, and she was a little bit shocked when she was told what it really meant, and she stops using it. And maybe another time when I'm in better humor, I'll tell you. But so now, for Yom Tov, the second day of Yom Tov, there was a lot of leniency because the second day of Yom Tov is already rabbinic, and we know it's rabbinic today. To have Gentiles, for example, if somebody dies on Yom Tov, we can have Gentiles bury the person. Second day of Yom Tov, Jews should bury the individual. Today, we don't do it at all because of issues of where the cemeteries are and driving there, whatever. But that's a case where it's a distinction between the first day Yom Tov, second day Yom Tov. Especially when Jews expanded to Europe, and especially in Northern Europe, where winters got very cold, and there was a need to have stoves burning on Shabbat. There were ways found to get people to come in to the Jewish households and make sure the fires were burning on Shabbat, especially in the synagogues and also often in the homes. And today, those who are observant, who would not turn on the light, if somebody's not Jewish, walks into a room and turns on the light, I can walk into that room and use the light. I didn't do anything. I can't tell them not to turn it off when they walk out. If we walk in together and I say something like, it's awfully dark in here, and they turn it on, if they need it for themselves, okay. But that's got stretched to what you were asking about, the people will do things. It's a much abused tradition, really should be used only in very narrow circumstances. Certainly should be, those things that are absolutely necessary. But when they're not necessary, they really should not be. For example, you cannot have somebody who's not Jewish cook food for you on Shabbat. And as a matter of fact, there's a story in the Talmud that, and then lots of other questions ancillary to it, but a rabbi was coming from the synagogue on Shabbat, and the guy was cooking some fish. And let's say he was just roasting it over a fire. And he offers the rabbi, and the rabbi ate it. And next Shabbos he came by, the guy offered him fish again. And the rabbi said, no, no, no. One time you weren't really interested in giving me fish. Now you may be cooking extra fish for me. Okay? So that was not, they didn't want to permit it. So if you're not allowed to do it in Shabbat, if it's absolutely necessary for well-being, then that's the room for opening the door to the Shabbat Gentile, Shabbos Goy. Now, the rabbis also said that on Shabbat you should have a hot meal. Hot meals are important. And so you were allowed, if food was mostly raw, and it couldn't be eaten in that state, you could leave it on the fire. If it's already edible and the cooking makes it better, you couldn't leave it on the fire. So one of the ways that is done is to have a warming plate, or a piece of metal put over a gas stove, and food be left on it for eating Friday night. Now the question is, what about the next day? And there are differences of opinion. Some will not allow you to put it onto the hot tray. Others will put you on the hot tray as long as it's a very low temperature. You're not really heating it up very much, and it's not going to cause it to cook. Others say you can't do it straight from the refrigerator, but if you let it out for a while and it's warmed up to air temperature, then you can do it. Different practices. A lot of people will put food on to be warmed on Shabbat as long as it's at low temperature. And there are plenty who will not. Right? My son will not do that, and my oldest son. Right? We do. Okay. And when you do something like that, it has to be a food item that's a solid. I couldn't have my chicken soup and put it on the hot plate on the hot tray for lunch. Because when something is liquid, cooking is cooking. It makes no difference. If it's already been cooked, it's cooked. But it's liquid, you're heating it up. So it cannot be something that's liquid. If it's a solid piece of chicken like that, that's where the permission is to be found. Now, if you want hot water, there are hot pots that'll keep the water hot up for unhurned, that keeps the water hot. That kind of a thing. Now, what is it? People next. So now, along with all of these other things, comes the idea that in Aramaic is called uvda dechol, weekday activity. The rabbi said Shabbat is supposed to be special. It's supposed to be different. You're supposed to make it into something different by how you act. When you set the table, you don't put you put the best dishes on the table. If you have fancy silverware, you put fancy silverware on the table. All right? You have to eat, all week long you eat. Well, Shabbat, the meals should be special. I mean, some people think pizza is special, but that's not really my thing for Shabbat. Now, you don't have to have a specific menu. You don't have to have soup and roasted chicken. Nowhere is it written anywhere that the Shabbat dinner must be chicken soup and roasted chicken. It was common because those were common things to have. Meat was something people didn't have very often. And if you keep kosher, you don't have it very often today because you can't afford it. But you can have whatever's a nice meal. If you're a vegetarian, so make a very good, nice vegetarian dish, not the stuff you might slap together during the week. Put some effort into it. Dress it up. If you are not vegan and you like quiche, but you don't eat meat, so have a nice quiche, a fancier one. Right? Whatever you do, make it a nice meal. That's the point. The way it happens in my home, first, our Shabbos meals, usually my wife always makes more than we need, and so we eat most of the rest of the week, we're eating the leftovers anyway. Monday night, okay, she's going over her menus for Shabbat, writing it down. Tuesday, she goes to the grocery store. And Tuesday or Wednesday, she starts cooking for Shabbat. And bless her, she cooks and bakes and makes challah and makes my special gluten-free challah, oat challah. Okay. Now you don't have to be that love her dearly crazy, but put some effort into it. If it means Thursday night, okay, Thursday night, stay up a little later Thursday night, watch the TV while you're finishing cooking. Similarly with lunch, it should be nicer. When I deal with a couple that's getting married, one of the things I tell them, and this is something very nice in Canada, it's still very, very prevalent, is that a lot of families get together Friday night, even if they're not terribly observant. Friday night dinner is a very strong Jewish custom. And I really emphasize that to a couple getting married. Friday night, if you don't do anything else, Friday night dinner is for us as a family. Nothing interferes with it. The games have to wait till we're through a dinner. You don't go out at that time. That's our special time together as a family, if nothing else. The more you put together to make it Shabbat, the better it would be. You're not watching TV. You know, there's some would say you're not supposed to watch TV all week long. I'm not one of them. I'm a TV addict. I'm sorry. Child of my upbringing. But read a good book. Preferably you read something Jewish. Study what you learn in this class. Look at the Torah portion. Review your Talmud from the lesson of the past week. Your Daf Yomi or whatever. That's what I do. I spend most of Shabbat reading, studying of some kind. Eating, we're not big on singing, but we should be more. Like people around, we sing a little more at the dinner table. Study, talk to each other. No phones around, so that's no problem. Yeah, make it a special day. You know, I said Shabbat comes no matter what you do, but you make it into what Shabbat can be. What you put into it is what you get out of it. If you put nothing into it, you'll get nothing out of it. There was a Jewish thinker in the 19th century, Chad Ha'am, who wasn't necessarily the most religious of people, but he said a wonderful saying. He says, more than Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. The more you put into it, the more you share, have guests for Shabbat. That's one of the nice things. If you live in a neighborhood where there are people going out, where I walk to shul in the morning, there are people going in my direction, that way, this way, different synagogues. They're all over the place. All of us doing the same thing. We're going to the synagogue, going to shul. Creates the Sabbath atmosphere. That's one of the nice things about living near the synagogue. That's why when Jews in the 1950s began to leave the cities. The Jewish population, of course, was not confined to the cities. There were Jews who've been in America since the 1840s and even earlier. But the biggest bulk of Jewish immigration to North America, US and Canada, was in around the beginning of the 20th century, the 1880s, and a little bit later here, a generation or so later in Canada. And so they mostly lived in the cities. Following World War II, especially, started moving out into the suburbs, and they didn't live near a synagogue. The conservative movement, some of the rabbis said, look, we think it's better for them to come to the synagogue, even if it means driving on Shabbat, rather than not coming to the synagogue. So there was a ruling by some of the by the conservative movement that said, if you need to drive to and from Shabbat, to and from synagogue to attend services on Shabbat, you may do so, but only to and from, not anywhere else. Not to go shopping, not to do things like that. Some will say, to join with the family for Shabbat dinner. I recognize that, and people do that, and I would never tell people they cannot do that. But if I'm asked, should you, I would say, can you keep Shabbat without driving? Can you make it a real Shabbat without driving? I lost a member of my synagogue many years ago because basically I said to him, you should be driving to my synagogue. There's another synagogue you can walk to. Lost a member. And the nature of that is because when you live near the synagogue, you're almost bound to be living near other Jews. You're more likely to create sense of community around the synagogue, and it makes for a better Shabbat. There are lots of issues with that, I know, and prices. Synagogues seem to always be in the expensive neighborhoods. They weren't when they started there, but then by the time they get built up, then they become places where people want to move, and houses go up in value. But try, the best you can. It really makes a big difference. Friday afternoon, you come home from work. What time do you light candles? 18 minutes before Shabbat. If you cannot get home before that time, do not light candles later than sunset. You're not fulfilling anything by violating the Sabbath to light a candle. Okay? Make sure that the Sabbath meal is a celebratory meal. It's got to be something nice. Whatever your menu is, whatever your food tastes and food are, it should be nice. You should have 2 loaves of bread on the table, uncut. This represents the double portion of manna that fell on Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, Friday morning rather. You put it on the table is nicely set. The 2 challahs are covered. The 2 loaves of bread. They don't have to be challah. Bread, any kind of bread can do. Challah just means it's an egg bread. Or it's sometimes without egg. It's just sometimes with raisins, sometimes with poppy seed, out poppy seed, whatever. One should have wine to make the kiddush. We'll talk about more depth next time. And the whole meal then becomes a way of celebrating. Just like some people have a way of watching a Super Bowl, you got to sit in front of the TV with your wings and what other foods you eat. Shabbat, you have to sit down at the table with or grape juice if you don't drink wine, grape juice. If you are a wine connoisseur, there's some very nice kosher wines. You don't have to have that sweet Kiddush wine. There's nice Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot. Shiraz, my wife likes the Shiraz from Australia, from Israel, from France, from California, even some from Niagara. There's a kosher wine that comes out of Niagara. And make it yours. Lunch, similarly, you have to have the two loaves of bread, a special meal, make the kiddush with it. Again, all of that we'll go over more next week. Okay? Any questions? Okay, please remember, you are allowed to wear clothes on Shabbat when you're walking outside. Don't say. Okay. And look, if you did not get on the list for the WhatsApp group, means I don't have your phone number. If I don't have your phone number, I probably have your email. If you haven't got an email from me, that means I haven't got your email either. Got it? Yeah, and you should have got both of you should have got it. So if you didn't get the WhatsApp, please send me an email with your phone number, your address information, okay? So that we can put you on there and we'll able to supply it. Also, try to hold on to the information for the Zoom. It doesn't change. What happened to me? I froze. All right. So please, God, have a wonderful time this weekend, the Shabbat and Simchat Torah. If you want to have lots of fun, I suggest finding a synagogue where they do lots of dancing and everything on Saturday night and Sunday morning too. Okay? Be well.
Yeah.